I was trying to visualize myself walking up to Bill Monroe and pointing a finger and saying, "Every penny, Bill, or you'll never play the opera again." And I thought better of it. It didn't seem like the kind of thing I should say.
Hey everyone, welcome back to you regular listeners, and greetings to anyone who is a first-time listener. This is the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. I'm your host, Keith Billick, and I'm here churning out some important banjo content to keep you warm through these winter months that we are all bracing for. I shouldn't say we're all bracing for, because you know who's not bracing for winter? Clint Myers, and that's because he lives down in Australia, where it is probably nice and balmy at this point. And the reason I bring up Clint is because he is today's Patreon supporter of this episode. Now, he says he doesn't have too much bluegrass to listen to down there, but because of the podcast, he's been able to check out really cool bands such as Green Sky Bluegrass and the infamous String Dusters. Well, Clint, those are two fantastic choices, and I love hearing about people discovering new music through the show. And I hope you continue to do that, because there's a lot of talented players out there. So anyway, thank you again, Clint Myers, for your support. For everyone else, go to patreon.com/banjopodcast and learn how to become a supporter of the show. I couldn't do it without you listeners, and really appreciate your generosity. Other than that, support the show by rating and liking and sharing episodes, and just stay in touch. We have a great community of fellow picky-fingered people out there, and love being in touch with all of you. Speaking of being in touch with all of you, feel free to reach out with any questions or comments or suggestions or anything else like that. I can be reached at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com, or you can find me on most of the common social media platforms and connect with me that way. So you know what I said to myself the other day? I said, Keith, you know what we haven't done in a while? We haven't had our old buddy Aaron Jonah Lewis host an episode in quite a while. And a lot of you remember the episodes featuring him and then also introducing him as a potential contributor to some of these interviews. So that's what we have for you today. And this is actually one that was done pre-COVID times. Don't ask why it took so long. Let's just say maybe I was keeping a few aces up my sleeve just in case, I don't know, a global pandemic hit and I needed to supplement my normal interview process that got disrupted. So yeah, this was one that Aaron did quite a while ago, but I'm excited to be able to release it now for you to hear. This episode's featured guest is Steve Arkin. Steve is a well-known banjo performer and educator and has a long history of playing some great bluegrass music. He was a member of Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys and is famously known as Bill Monroe's favorite backup banjo player. So that is extremely high praise, especially for all of us who know how important backup playing is. He's gone on to explore more of the old-time world recently, and the guest host, Aaron, does a real good job of covering both of those. There are some really great stories of his time with Bill Monroe that I know that you will all love. So sit back and enjoy this interview with Steve Arkin, conducted by Aaron Jonah Lewis.
Welcome to the Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast. My name is Aaron Jonah Lewis, and we're here today with Steve Arkin in Melrose, Massachusetts. Say hi, Steve.
Hi, everybody.
So Steve is a banjo player who has explored the reaches of bluegrass and old-time music. The past few decades, he's really been into old-time music, but he did used to play with Bill Monroe's band, and he used to hang out in New York City with all the scene pioneers of the day. and we're going to get some stories about Bill Monroe and about the other people who were around in those days, and just get Steve's story. Let's hear about your musical background. How did you first find out about banjo music?
Good question. I was in a musical family, and not everybody, but enough, a critical mass of people. My father's brother, Dave Arkin, and his brother, Sandy, both played guitar and both sang folk songs. Dave wrote a lot of songs for the People's Songbook back in the 40s and was in that circle of, Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie and Leadbelly and everybody. So I got some of that influence through them. My sister Dave's son, Alan, the actor, was a folk singer before he was an actor. And he was in a group called the Tarriers that in its original form had a #1 hit in 1954, I think, called the Banana Boat Song.
Yeah.
And another one called Cindy, Oh Cindy. And Alan was the lead singer on most of it, or much of it, certainly on the Banana Boat Song he was. And he taught me my first few guitar chords, and my sister taught me some more and taught me some strums.
How old were you at the time? Roughly.
When I started playing guitar, probably 13, 14 maybe. And I, the music that I listened to at home was the Weavers and Pete Seeger and Burl Ives, who you're not supposed to have listened to in retrospect, and Gene Ritchie and Woody Guthrie and Leadbelly. I mean, all the people who were in that circle listened to back then, in most cases deservedly so. And what the banjo, I think I heard some banjo playing. I think I can actually trace the moment of epiphany when I really fell in love with the banjo to a recording of the Weavers at Carnegie Hall, where Pete Seeger played an opening frailing, because he didn't call it clawhammer, and he didn't get his thumb off the 5th string, but he had a frailing solo on Darling Corey that, from where I was at that time, totally astonishing and fascinating. And I think it was that moment when it happened. And I also had the older brother of a friend of mine across the street played the banjo, and I went to camp and there were banjo players there. And slowly but surely, I really became interested in it. And I had a friend down the block with whom I used to play chess. And he and I, we would go to Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village to play chess in the southwest corner of the park. And we ran into a friend who had a banjo in his hand and had one of those, and now found out years later, Winnie Winston designed thing that's based on the NRA, the original NRA, the National Recovery Act, eagle, emblem, and except that said NLCR, take us back to 1934 or whatever, 1932, 1929. I don't remember when it was. It was the New Lost City Ramblers emblem that Winnie Winston, who was a good friend of mine, a great banjo player, designed. And through him, I found out that people used to go to Washington Square Park on Sundays to jam. And it was at that point that I used to go in warm weather, starting in March and ending in November. People would go there every Sunday from 2 to 6, and then everybody would go to Chinatown afterwards. So I hung out there and I saw a variety of players. I saw all the members of the Greenbrier Boys and all the members of the New Lost City Ramblers there. I saw Roger Sprung, who in a recent book was described as looking like a cigar store Indian, which is remarkably perceptive of the author. And he was a good and interesting banjo player. He was a little sloppy, and sometimes we used to refer to him cruelly as old sausage fingers. But he actually he was actually a path-breaking banjo player nonetheless. So anyway, that's the beginning of my banjo thing. And in 1961, I met Bill Keith in Washington Square Park, and we headed off. And I spent a lot of time hanging around, playing music with him and learning, emulating what he did. And he gave me a few pointers. I've never taken a lesson in my entire life, but every now and then somebody solves some mystery, with a simple explanation, and that opens up another series of doors. So Keith definitely was influential, and I was a good friend. He and I used to go to parties together, and we used to go visit other banjo players together sometimes. And while I was in college in Vermont in 1964, in the spring of 1964, Keith called me up and said, "What are you doing this summer?" And I said, "I have no idea." And he said, "How would you like to play with Bill Monroe?" And I knew, I mean, Keith was playing with Bill Monroe. That was the talk. He had sort of started by playing with Jesus Loves His Mandolin Player. Oh, God, how can I lose those names of those people I knew so well? Lived in Saratoga, New York. Great mandolin player. You can't remember either? This is old-timer syndrome.
It'll come back to you. We can put that in later.
We can put it in later. In any event, he did go down and play with some Southern guys in Washington, you know, and that was already a path-breaking thing for a New York City bluegrass player to do, because mostly we were a self-contained little bubble. But he did go down and play with Bill Monroe. Ralph Rinsler, who had been the mandolin player in the Greenbrier Boys, got himself. Well, we all thought he was Bill Monroe's manager, but he was actually, Bill Monroe considered him an agent who booked the band into festivals and college concerts, but not into all the usual fare, you know, not into the church basements and drive-in movie theaters where the band usually played, and certainly not into the Opry. So in any event, Bill had been in the band for almost a year, and he was being seduced by the Queskin Jug Band. Maria D'Amato, who had been a bandmate of mine, you know, got hooked up with Jeff Muldor, and she moved up there and joined that band. And they needed a good banjo player. They had Bob Siggins of the Greenbrier Boys of the Charles River Valley Boys play with them for a while. Before that, they had Bruno Wolf, but they got Keith, and he and Rinsler were both concerned. Before Keith joined that band, there was a lot of concern that nobody was paying attention to Bill Monroe, who was truly the father of bluegrass music, although nobody knew that term. And that's why Rinsler got that job working with him, because Louise Scruggs, who was Earl's wife and who was the publicist for the Foggy Mountain Boys, essentially wrote Bill Monroe out of the history books of that music in promoting her husband's band. And Ralph thought that was unfair. And Ralph coined the term father of bluegrass music to apply to Bill Monroe. And he got this job to gain more visibility for the Bluegrass Boys. And getting Bill Keith to join the band was the icing on the cake, in that he had developed this melodic banjo style, which was called Keith style at the time. And he made almost as big an impact when he joined that band as Earl Scruggs did when he joined the band in 1945. People had never heard banjo playing like that before, and Monroe's career soared. You know, he became enormously popular and enormously famous almost overnight. And so the question was, what's going to happen to that style of banjo playing when Bill Keith leaves the Bluegrass Boys? And they both decided that the answer to the problem was getting me in the band, since I was a protege of Keith and could play in that style. So they sent me, do you want this whole story of how I got in the band?
Yeah.
It's a funny story. So I agreed to do it. I had to actually think about it, which is silly, but I did inevitably come to the conclusion that this would be a cool thing to do. And I was given instructions to just take a bus down to Nashville and to go to the studios at WSM on Friday night for the Friday Night Opry and go and meet Bill in the dressing room, and it was all set. So I took a 23-hour bus trip to Nashville from New York. It stopped everywhere. And by asking a lot of people, I finally found WSM and got backstage at the Opry. I was amazed at how easy it was to get into that room, and almost past, everybody who was anybody was there. Everybody from Johnny Cash to Grandpa Jones to Minnie Pearl to Roy Acuff to you name them, Porter Wagner. And that was pretty exciting. I also ran into Jim and Jesse McReynolds and Alan Shelton, who I had met at Sunset Ranch. I used to go to Sunset Park in West Grove, Maryland with Winnie Winston for several years before that to hear bluegrass acts who they continually booked there. So I'd gotten to know them. So at least there was somebody I knew back there. They were pretty friendly. Anyway, so Monroe finally walked into the room and I walked up to him and I said, "Hi, Bill, I'm Steve Arkin." And didn't raise an eyebrow, nothing, just looked right through me. I said, "I'm your new banjo player." I was 19, looked right through me again. And I said, "Bill Keith and Ralph Rinsler told me to come down here," and say, just turned on his heel and walked away from me. And I didn't even have enough money to get a bus on the way back with me. So I was sort of thunderstruck. And so I found Alan Shelton and I told him the whole story. And I said, "What do I do now?" And he said, "Talk to Ken Marvin." I said, "Who's Ken Marvin?" He said, "That's Bill's manager." I said, "I thought Ralph was his manager." Well, Bill was the road manager and also drove the bus. So he introduced me to Ken Marvin. And I told him the whole story. And he said, "Well, I didn't hear nothing about that." He said, "Well, I don't know what to tell you. Just hang around here and, maybe Bill will come up and talk to you. I don't know." So I sat for hours. I just stood there with a banjo case and a suitcase with all these, legends of country music milling around me. And toward the end of the show, toward the end of the evening, Monroe walked up to me and I'm standing there with my coat on, with my banjo in his case, leaning on it. And he starts playing the mandolin. He walks right up to me. He's got the mandolin right in my face and he starts playing one tune after another. And I didn't know how to interpret that. I didn't know if he was demonstrating or showing off or if he expected me to play with him. And I had been brought up to believe that the role of the banjo player when a mandolin is playing is not to roll, just to chop chords. That has evolved. That's changed. But at the time, that was a pretty strict rule. So I thought, I'm going to take my banjo out of the case and just go chop, 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 chop behind this mandolin. What am I supposed to do here? And I didn't want to swap. I didn't know if I should be swapped. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. He played probably 12 different tunes in my face. And then he just turned on his heel and walked away. And I really didn't know what to make of it. I mean, it was very strange. And then a little while, Ken Marvin walked up to me and said, I told him what happened. And he said, "Why don't you stay in the Y with Sandy?" And I said, "Who's Sandy?" And he said, "Sandy Rothman. He's a kid from California who's writing a paper about Bill Monroe. And he's traveling with the band and you could share a room at the Y with him." So I found Sandy, who was a great musician, by the way. Wasn't necessarily the easiest person. He and I didn't get along great, but I have a lot of respect for his musicianship. I think he was not happy that I became the banjo player, which is what he was aspiring to. But in any event, so I found Sandy and we did stay at the Y. We stayed there for several nights. The first night that I was there, we heard somebody fiddling with the lock and we both got really nervous. And I thought of calling down to the desk and reporting it. Sandy didn't want me to, thought we shouldn't make any sound at all, but I whispered to the desk. I said, "Somebody's trying to get into our room. Did you send somebody?" They said, "We'll see." And then about 5 minutes later, I heard a voice say, "Drop it." And then I heard shots and we just cowered in that room. We didn't go out. And the next morning when we opened the door, there was no sign of anything. When I went downstairs and said, "What happened?" Told them what room we were in. I said, "What happened in our room last night?" And the person at the desk said, "I didn't hear anything." So I don't know what that was all about, but and that was pretty scary introduction to Nashville at that time. So we were there for several days. And then I got a phone call again from Ken Marvin who says, "Bill wants you at the Gulf Station in Goodlettsville at 5 a.m. tomorrow." And I said, where's Goodlettsville? He says, it's out of town. I said, well, I don't have a car. How do I get there? He says, you don't have a car. He says, okay, I'll have Missy pick you up. So I said, who's Missy? He said, that's Bill's daughter. So I said, sure. I said, how will I recognize her? He said, she's got a blue Eldorado convertible. No, it wasn't. It was a Pontiac Bonneville, blue Pontiac Bonneville convertible. So I was up at 5 o'clock in the morning, standing out in front, and I was there for about a half an hour when this blue Pontiac convertible comes up with Missy, who had this big hair, dark hair, but big hairdo. Says, are you Steve? Daddy's telling me I should fetch you, so hop in. So I hopped in, and she drove me out to this Gulf station and drove off. And I was there alone. It was dark or darkish. I mean, it was just beginning to dawn. And it's a very long station with a little kiosk in the middle of it. And there was the blue bus, the Bluegrass Boys bus was parked there. And nobody was around. So I just sort of stood there in the early dawn hours. And then after about 10, 15 minutes, a car got up and parked, and another guy I was standing at one end of the station. Another guy got out at the extreme other end of the station with a banjo case. And here we were with our banjos at opposite ends, probably 400-foot long gas station. And I didn't feel like making any overtures towards him, and he didn't feel like making any overtures towards me. So we stood at our opposite ends. It was like we were going to have a gunfight or something. And we were there for another 15 or 20 minutes when a big battered old station wagon pulls up, and out hops out the rest of the band, which at that point, I think it was Joe Stewart was playing fiddle. I don't remember who was in it. And Jimmy Monroe was there to play bass, and Melissa was along to be the singer to fill the ecological niche that had previously been occupied by, what was her name? The Carolina Songbird, Bessie Lee Malden, with whom Bill was on the outs, but she always came in and sang one sort of country classic. And so Melissa was going to fill that. And Ken Marmon, who was going to drive the bus. And nobody said anything to me. They all got on the bus. And then Ken came out and waved for me to get on the bus. And I got on the bus. And the bus started driving. And we drove about a half an hour. Nobody said anything to anybody. And I finally said, so politely and quietly as I could, so where are we headed? And I think Joe Stewart gave me an elbow and said, you don't ask that question. So, anyway, where we were driving was to Columbus, Ohio, to Freedom Ranch in Columbus, Ohio, where they went out and with the other banjo player, and they played 3 full sets, and we all got on the bus. And we all came back. We slept on the bus, and we came back to Nashville the next day. And I went back I didn't get to play anything. And then I got called again to go. I got picked up by Missy the day after that. And we went on the road for 3 days to Greer and Spartanburg and Livonia, Georgia, I think, or somewhere around there. The first time they played, they called me up in the middle of the last set to play one tune. That's the first time Monroe ever heard me play the banjo. And I played a tune. He thanked me, and I left the stage. The next day, he called me up in the middle of the third set, but left me on that next afternoon. He left me on stage after I played the one tune. In the set after that, he called me up at the beginning of the third set. And the day after that, I started the concert, and he called Gene, the other banjo player, up in the middle of the third set, left him on stage. And the final gig of that tour, I played the whole thing, and Gene got to play one tune and then got thanked and excused from the stage at the end of the third set. I never found out who that guy Gene was. I don't think he was in that band for very long, but in any event, I sort of felt sorry for him. But I did. I mean, it had all been prearranged. Nobody ever acknowledged the whole business with Keith and Rinsler about me going down there. I'm sure there was communication, but I never heard anything about it at that end of the band. So anyway, that's the long story about how I joined the Bluegrass Boys. And there are too many long stories about what I did when I was there. We'll use up all your time. So
We got time. We want to hear more. Yeah. What sort of banjo were you playing?
When I was in that band, I had a no holes board 1930 arch top Granada that I had gotten from Ben Rifkin, the brother of Josh Rifkin. Do you know who Joshua Rifkin is? Mm-hmm. His brother Ben had a couple of good banjos, and I got that one from him. I had swapped an RB5 for it. And right after I played in the band, I was able to get an original 5-string RB7 top tension, which I stupidly sold 3 years later. I wish I still had it. So that's the answer to that question.
Yeah. So, more stories about
Monroe.
How long did you end up playing with the band?
I played with the band. I started playing with them in early June. And I had to go back to college because I was already enrolled and my parents had already paid my tuition. But in addition to that, I knew that we were going to play the Philadelphia Folk Festival. And I found out from Keith that I had come in second at that festival for the that was the biggest banjo contest in the country at the time. And it was the only one that was blind judged. The judges sat under the stage. They didn't, and the contestants had a number. So the judges, unless they recognized you playing, which they didn't know who you were, which was supposed to ensure fairness. So I'd come in second in 62 and 63, and I wanted to enter it in 64. And Keith told me that if I was performing at the festival, I wasn't eligible to compete. So since I had to leave the band anyway, I told Bill that I was going to do that, and I told him that it was because I wanted to win that banjo contest. And he said that was okay. And I saw them there. He was very happy that I won the contest. It's too bad they didn't let me stay in the band and compete too, because I think that would have been the only time we played above the Mason-Dixon line in my entire tenure with that band. And I wasn't playing with the band at that time.
Hey, sorry to interrupt everybody, but I just couldn't resist an opportunity to tell you about the world's most trusted source for new, used, and vintage fretted instruments, and that, of course, is Elderly Instruments, which is a family-owned business located in Lansing, Michigan. But if you're not in Lansing, that's okay. They ship worldwide, too, and they just have a vast selection of acoustic guitars, electric guitars, ukuleles, mandolins, all the accessories and books that you'd want for either of those, and of course plenty and plenty of banjos. And something that people don't often think about when you're buying stuff like that, particularly entry-level instruments, is the fact that they have a world-renowned repair shop as well. When all those instruments come into the store, if they do not pass a thorough setup and inspection by the repair shop, they get sent back, and that sometimes angers the suppliers of Elderly Instruments, but it lets you know that Elderly stands by their products, and they also have a helpful and knowledgeable sales staff to help you find what you need, and you can be confident that you're going to get something that is set up to Elderly's high quality standards. So if that sounds great, and I know it does, check them out at elderly.com or call 517-372-7880 to speak to one of their helpful salespeople. It's where I go, and it's where you should go too. The Picky Fingers Banjo Podcast is also proud to be sponsored by Peghead Nation. With Peghead Nation's streaming video courses, perfect for quarantine by the way, but they have courses in banjo, guitar, mandolin, fiddle, dobro, upright bass, and ukulele. You can learn bluegrass, old time, and plenty of other styles from some of the most talented players and instructors in roots music. For example, listen to some of the courses. These are just the banjo courses that they offer. A couple different classes with Bill Evans, such as beginning banjo and bluegrass banjo. You can learn clawhammer banjo with Evie Layden, Wade Ward style banjo with Bruce Molsky, the banjo according to Danny Barnes, and also contemporary bluegrass banjo with Wesley Corbett. And each of those courses includes high-quality multi-angle video lessons, downloadable notation and tab, play-along tracks, and plenty of tunes and songs to play. So it's everything you need to up your skills, especially in these isolated times. And listen up, because this is the best part. If you join any of Peghead Nation's video courses now, you're going to get your first month free by going to pegheadnation.com and use the promo code pickyfingers at checkout. That's pickyfingers, all one word, all lowercase, at pegheadnation.com. Check it out.
Anyway, there were a bunch of adventures. One of the interesting adventures was that we were headed to some other country music park in Frederick, Maryland. And outside of Roanoke, the car broke down. The bus broke down, rather, sorry. Oh, it wasn't outside of Roanoke. The bus broke down in Roanoke. And Bill was furious. You know, the song Heavy Traffic had, the Bluegrass Boys are never late. Mm-hmm. He was really unhappy about that. And the next morning, you know, he was just fuming. And but I looked out the window and we were broken down right in front of Don Reno's garage. So he didn't want to let anybody off the bus. I said, can I go and, you know, I'll go and find Don. You know, they could fix the bus. And they could probably lend us a car too. So he let me go out and I went through the garage hollering for Don. And a guy came up and said, Don's out of town. Who are you? And I said, well, I was with the Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys. Our bus is broken down right outside. And we were wondering if you could fix the bus and maybe lend us a vehicle. So, because we have a gig to make. The guy turned out to be, what's his name? The founder, Carlton Haney, was managing the garage. The father of the Bluegrass Festival was the guy who was running Keith's garage in Roanoke. And Carlton said, well, I don't know about finding you a car. I said, we've got to have one. Somehow we have to get a car. So he fixed us up with a 1949 black Ford four-door sedan that had no shocks and that had no muffler. And we had the six of us at that time, by the way, being Sandy Rothman, guitar, me, banjo, Benny Williams, fiddle, Melissa Monroe, country songs, Bill Monroe, and Ken Marvin. I think maybe we left Ken Marvin behind because he wouldn't fit. Anyway, yeah, because then we were going to try to hightail it to the gig. So he made Benny Williams the designated driver. The mountains are pretty, you know, windy up there. There was no Interstate 81 at the time. So we were going over these secondary roads up and down mountains at over 90 miles an hour. And it was really tough. And we needed to make the gig on time. So, you know, I was sitting in the back seat and Melissa was sitting next to me and Monroe was sitting on the other side of her. And we'd been riding for a while. And she said, Daddy, I got to pee. And Bill said, now, Missy, you know, we can't afford to stop. You're just going to have to hold that. And she says, Daddy, I got to pee. Can I tell this story on your radio show? Yeah. Okay. And he said, Missy, we got to keep going. And she's, Daddy, I can't hold it anymore. I suddenly started feeling really uncomfortable because I was sitting right next to her and I didn't know what. So anyway, he did consent to allowing us to stop at a gas station so she could deal with that. But I was sure that that wasn't going to end well. But in any event, so we finally did make it to Freedom Ranch. I mean, this hectic drive. It wasn't Freedom Ranch. I don't remember the name of the place that was in Frederick, but there was a country music park. There were a lot of country music parks in those days. So we got all set up. We had a stage in the middle of the midway, and there was no ceiling or canopy or awning or anything over it. And the heavens opened, and it was a huge rainstorm. And we had to play 3 full sets with our valuable antique instruments with nobody hearing. We were the proverbial tree in the forest with no one there to hear it. Nobody heard us. There was no place, there's no shelter there. And we kept saying, Bill, you know, this is destroying our instruments. You know, nobody's listening. He says, we have to pay, or we don't pay. You have to play to get paid or something. So we were kind of stuck there. And we played the whole thing. I remember turning my banjo upside down and having water pouring out of the resonator. We never got hurt by a single person. We played 3 full sets of music there. And on the way back, the entire exhaust system, other than the muffler, which was already gone, fell out of the car from the manifold on. And we were stuck on a mountaintop and we were trying to get back. We were not too far out of Roanoke, but we were just sort of stuck there. And Monroe, again, was kind of getting antsy about it. And I said, why don't, we just go down and flag a car down? And he wouldn't do that. He didn't think that was the right thing to do. And I kept pestering him about how that might be a good idea. So finally he put James Monroe, out there. And he just stood next to the car with his hands at his sides. And I said, Bill, why don't you tell him he's got to wave or stick out his thumb or something? And Bill said, no, he's out there. He's doing what he needs to do. So he just stood there and cars drove by him. Then he got back in and said, well, that ain't working. So then I suggested, then maybe we find a farmhouse that has a phone. There were no cell phones in 1964, and then we can phone in the garage and maybe, somebody will send a car out for us. So he dispatched me and Benny Williams to go up the hill to farmhouse. So we come to the first farmhouse and I'm walking up the front path and Benny is hanging outside by the gate like he knew something. And I knock on the door and the door opens and there's a double-barrel shotgun pointing right at my nose. And I said, look, I'm sorry. Look, we're with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys and our car just broke and we need to call Don Reno's garage in Roanoke and get him to pick us up. He says, I'm going to count to 10 and you're going to get off my property. So I had to go. I mean, that was really scary. And at that point, Benny wanted to go back. And I said, let's just try another house. It can't be that every house is going to do that. The next house, they were very kind. They let us use the phone. And they sent Ronnie Reno, Don's son, great mandolin player. This was when he was like 16 years old. And he came out in his red Pontiac Bonneville supercharged convertible and met us at the side of the bus. And nobody else had the courage to get into that car with Ronnie. So they made me get into the car. And we had to ride down at over 120 miles an hour down that mountain around these curves. It was the scariest thing possible. And he kept going, Yahoo! He was really having a lot of fun. So I got down there and then Carlton let me take the bus back up to pick up the guys, which I'd never driven a bus before. That was an interesting experience too. There were a million stories like that from that not very long summer. Those are 2 representative tales. Will they suffice? There's another good story in Richard Smith's book called Boss Men. No, it's called Baby, Let Me Follow You Down. Or it's called Can't You Hear Me Calling? I don't even remember what the name of that book was, but there's a whole chapter about the circumstances later in the summer. I did what I found out later every single Bluegrass Boy has done, which is to say, when are you going to pay me, Bill? That was kind of tough too. He wasn't generous with compensation, but he was a very nice man and he was always nice to me and he always said nice things to me and about me for the rest of his life. That sound was mail coming through the mailbox.
Very homey sound.
It is a homey sound.
Why do you think he liked you so much? I mean, not to say people would naturally like you anyways.
But that doesn't necessarily follow, but
people have different, stories about Bill Monroe. And somehow you fit in great in his band and he really liked you.
Well, he one thing that he said at the time and he said afterwards is that he really liked my backup playing. In Jim Rooney's book, he had a quote where he actually said that I was his favorite backup banjo player. So that's one reason. I mean, that's certainly important. The funny thing is, I'm not sure I agreed with him because one of my very favorite banjo players at that time was Alan Shelton, still is to this day, who played with Jim and Jesse and he had a sort of swinging right hand that people used to call it the Shelton bounce. And I thought it was really an exciting way to play the banjo. And he was very influential on me and on Bill Keith and on lots of other people. And when I was having a conversation with him about who's your favorite banjo player, and he was naming various people, and I asked him what he thought of Alan Shelton, and he said, that boy has no sense of time. And only recently have I come to understand that what he meant by that was that Alan Shelton's sense of time was different from Bill Monroe's sense of time. The two of them are two of the people with the most interesting senses of rhythm in the entire world of bluegrass, but not necessarily compatible. So I don't know. I think that part was it. Part of it was he was flattered at the time to have people from the North, that his music was attracting people from outside its original regional boundaries. And he was thrilled that Keith came down and played with him. And, and I was another on my heels, and Sandy Rothman too. And then on our heels, Gene Lowinger and Richard Green and Peter Rowan, especially, and some other important players as well, came from the North or from the West. And, that was part of that sort of made him proud that his music was becoming that popular and that widespread in its following.
Did you ever encounter any anti-Semitism?
Well, this was the summer of 1964, which was, if you remember, Freedom Summer. I believe this is the summer that Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were murdered in Mississippi, among other things. And maybe some of the Selma, I'm not sure which of the horrifying encounters took place that summer, but it was Freedom Summer. I had actually gone on some freedom rides the previous summer, not anything daring. We used to go on Route 95 between Baltimore and Washington to integrate restaurants at the service areas on Route 95. Essex, was it Chesapeake House and Maryland House were actually segregated. And that was the most activist civil rights that I'd done prior to 1964. But every single store I walked into during my tenure with Monroe, every single place I went, every store, every gas station, every place, it's like they had talking points. They all had the same talking points assigned to them. They always said, "You're not from around here, are you? Are you sure?" They always said this. I don't know if I want to mock their accents or just say it in my own. "Are you sure you're not down here to interfere with our way of life?" That was the standard question. I don't know where they got that. Everybody asked me that question. It was amazing. So I had the most awkward encounter was in, I think another visit to Livonia, Georgia was where this happened, which is right in the mountains of Georgia, right near where South Carolina and Georgia and North Carolina all meet. And at some point, I used to have to ask Bill, I want to go and get breakfast. And I say, "Bill, could I get some money? I need to get breakfast." And he'd say, "Well, how much do you reckon you'll need, Steve?" And I'd say, "Well, how about $2? And he'd say, "That's too much. You can get a fine breakfast for 75 cents. And that's what I'm going to give you." That was really, that was difficult, to maintain your sense of pride and self-worth and having to go groveling like that. So, finally in Livonia, I think I just said, "Bill, couldn't you just pay me on a regular basis the way you do the other guys in the band?" Not realizing that he wasn't paying anybody on a regular basis. And he said, and I quote, "You Jewish people are all alike. You're all after the almighty dollar." I didn't know what to say. I don't think I had a record. I don't think I said anything. I was a little thunderstruck by that. And I think at that point I resolved to it was getting on in August and it was time, I had the festival banjo contest to go to and I had to go back to college in Vermont. And I guess I figured maybe I'd done this long enough, but I did go and I called the musicians union in Nashville and I told them the story. And the guy I spoke to, he was being helpful and he said, and I quote, "You tell Monroe that he'll give you every cent that's coming to you or he'll never play the Opry again." And I was trying to visualize myself walking up to Bill Monroe and pointing a finger and saying, "Every penny, Bill, or you'll never play the Opry again." And I thought better of it. It didn't seem like the kind of thing I should say. But anyway, so there was a little friction in the air. And so I decided I would just call my parents and ask them to wire me some money so I could get home and start, practicing for the banjo contest and catching up on other stuff. I had a girlfriend back in New York that I wanted to see. So I had a lot of motives for going back. So I asked several people where the nearest payphone was, and there was only one payphone in town, and it was in this gas station. It was like a 7-point intersection, like spokes coming out of this hub of a wagon wheel in the center of town then. And it was all dirt roads. And in the center of town was this gas station that had like an oval shaped kiosk in the middle and then pumps on all four sides. And, there was one entrance into that kiosk, which is where the phone was, because I asked somebody and they said, it's inside. So there was a bunch of people who were all wearing bib overalls and had big bushy beards. No offense to Aaron, who has one. And they were all sucking on reeds and chewing tobacco and everything. And, I just sort of walked up and said, "Excuse me, I'd like to use the phone." And they sort of parted, and I walked in. And as I was walking up to the phone, I could feel the pressure of their eyes on my back. They all walked in and sort of formed a circle around me. Just as I was saying to the operator, "I'd like to make a collect call to Brooklyn, New York." And they're kind of looking at each other and poking each other in the ribs. And my mother answered the phone, and she said, "Steve, how are you? I'm so glad you called. We wanted to hear from you. Your father and I are just leaving to go to California. We're going to be incommunicado for 2 weeks." We're driving across country to go visit my father's brothers. So all I could say was, "I'm glad I caught you. I just want you to know what a great time I'm having down here picking the 5-string with Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys." And it's really wonderful. The hospitality here is great, and I just love it. And don't worry about me a bit. That was the end. She said, "Okay, bye-bye. We'll talk to you in 2 weeks." So I get off the phone, and one of the guys walks up to me and says, "So you're one of them Brooklyn Jew boys, aren't you? Are you sure you're not down here?" I shouldn't copy his accent, but I'm doing it. "Sure you're not down here to interfere with our way of life?" And I said, "No, I'm not." And he says, and did I hear you say you can pick a 5? I said, "Well, yeah." "And you're here with Bill?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I didn't hear anything that Bill's in town." I said, "Well, he is, They said, "Well, where's he at?" And I said, "Well, follow me and I'll show you." So I walked, and these guys are walking behind me. And we walk up to the bus, and Bill's leaning on the front of the bus with one foot up on the bumper and his Stetson hat pulled down over his eyes, and he's filing nails on his left hand. And he looks up and he sees this scene of me walking up the street with these guys behind me. And there's a sort of a faint, sadistic smile on his face. And I say, "Hey, Bill." And he says nothing. He's just filing his nails. And then I said, "Hey, Bill, these guys didn't know you were going to be in town." Doesn't say anything. So finally, one of those guys pushes me out of the way and says, "Bill, we found this Jew boy down at the gas station, and he's trying to tell us he can pick a 5. And we know no Yankee can pick a 5. We know he's down here to interfere with our way of life, right?" And Bill doesn't say anything for a long time, and then gradually he tilts his hat back up on his head, and he looks up and he looks over at them and he says, "I believe he can." So anyway, that was my heart was kind of beating pretty heavily at that point. And then it was all good. I mean, he really was nice to me. And every time I went to hear that band play, he called me up on stage and left me on for the rest of the set. It was always fun to do that. And I think he did that with most of the Bluegrass Boys. I think that was sort of his, a tradition. It was like one of the bennies of being a Bluegrass boy.
You also played with the Kentucky Colonels. Is that right?
No, I was never, I was friends with them, but I never played with them. I did play in Northern Lights for a number of years. The earliest success, if you can call it success, that I had 2 years before I played with Bill Monroe, I was in a band in New York called the Downstate Rebels with Jody Stecker, who is a phenomenal musician, who was, I think he was 15 at the time, or 16 at the time. And Gene Lowinger, who went on to be a fiddler, the first Northern fiddler to play with Bill Monroe. Not long after I left the band, he joined the band along with Peter Rowan. So we formed a band called the Downstate Rebels, and we played the sort of hootenanny circuit around New York. And playing at Gertie's Folk City, they used to have a hootenanny night, open microphone night. On one Monday night, there was a talent scout who worked for Bobby Darin of Mac the Knife fame, who heard us and then asked us afterwards to give him our phone numbers. We didn't know about the Bobby Darin connection. He just said that he was a talent scout for a record company. Well, it turned out that Bobby Darin, we got invited to a meeting in the Brill building in New York, which is sort of the building with most of the record company executives in it, to meet with Bobby Darin, who told us that he wanted to produce an album of us in Atlantic Studios, which was the first 8-track studio in the history of recording. And he said that his motive for doing that, because we asked him, was that he was afraid that with the big folk revival, what we thought of as the great folk scare going on, that singers, crooners, or whatever you call him, his kind of singing, were going out of style. And he didn't know how long he could continue to be a singer. He didn't know he would remain in vogue. So he wanted to continue his career in music by becoming a record producer. And he said, and this is a quote, he said, "So I want, when you are on the Jack Parr show and he asks you, was Bobby Darin really there in the booth when you made your first record? You'd say, he was the engineer who recorded the whole thing and he gets the credit for it." That's what he wanted out of it. And we had meetings with our parents. We had a lawyer. We signed up a contract and everything. And we recorded this album. And what we didn't know how to do was to get the weak links out of the band. And they didn't know which instruments were playing leads and which instruments were playing rhythm. So they mixed it completely terribly. I mean, they didn't know if something was a banjo break or a mandolin break or a guitar break or a bass break or, So it was recorded under spectacular circumstances in this really great studio, but it didn't come out very well. It never got released. But the band got to play in Carnegie Hall and in Town Hall. Wow. In both cases at hootenannies, quote unquote. So that was fun. And that was sort of what started me thinking about playing out more. Anyway.
Okay, so we have about 10 minutes left to talk about where we are now, how we got to where we are now, because you don't play much bluegrass anymore. You do play some three fingers still, but in a different context. Three finger.
Peter Zago, who was the dobro player in the Downstate Rebels, which was a bluegrass band, has remained a friend of mine for a long time. We have a lot of interests in common. He's an architect. We're both interested in architectural history. He became interested in old time music when every now and then we'd fall out of touch. And a couple of years later, one of us would get in touch with the other. And I remember that in around 1991, he got back in touch with me and he had been playing old time music for a while. Banjo, fiddle, guitar. And he was at the time especially interested in banjos and in fact collecting banjos. And in fact, he put together by far the best collection of pre-Civil War banjos from the minstrel era. And also a nice collection of classic banjos from the 1880s and 1890s. So Zago, introduced me to old time, told me he was playing old time music. I wasn't that interested in it. I had played some old time music when I first started, before I heard Earl Scruggs, when I started playing around Washington Square, I played old time music. I loved the New City Ramblers. And when I lived in Ohio from 1969 to 73, I lived right around the corner from Lisa Ornstein, who was a great Quebecois fiddler, but who was a good old time fiddler. And we used to play with her and Peter Hoover, who died this year, who was a very important collector and a very good, one of the best pioneers of clawhammer banjo in the North. And so I had those as influences. But when I got back to New York in 73, I went right back into bluegrass and didn't give it another thought until I had to share the ride down to Clifftop with Zago, because he couldn't do it by himself. He needed somebody to share the driving. And I was not interested in going to Clifftop, the Southern Appalachian String Band Festival. And I kept saying that, I said, I like this music, but it's going to drive me crazy. It's so incredibly boring. And I remembered saying stupid things like, isn't this just like a catch basin for people who can't cut it in bluegrass? And more idiotic things of that ilk. And he played me, when I think back of the array of things that he played me to try to persuade me otherwise, it was incredibly great curatorial skills. I mean, he played all the best living guys and all the best dead guys. And I think I started to understand that there was some charm there. But when I got to Clifftop, I would say it was within 2 or 3 hours after walking around and listening to the quality of the music that was coming out of people and how much more exciting, how much more varied it was. As a bluegrass banjo player, I knew every bluegrass banjo player knows one crooked modal tune, and that's Clinch Mountain Backstep. I was privileged to know one other crooked modal tune, and that was Pretty Little Indian from the Lonesome Pine Fiddlers, the recording by Curly Ray Klein when he was in the Lonesome Pine Fiddlers. And I thought those were great tunes, but I didn't think there was another tune of that ilk out there. And at Clifftop, I discovered this cornucopia of them. And I discovered people who could play them so beautifully on fiddle, on banjo, as a string band, or just in small groups or whatever. And I just was blown away by it. And that's the only time in my entire life that I've done a 180-degree turn. That's an accurate measurement.
So if you don't have a Peter Zago to turn you on to old time music, what would you recommend people listen to? If, let's say bluegrass banjo players who maybe have had some exposure, but maybe don't think much of it, don't really know.
You have to sort of slide into it gradually. I guess I would listen to some contemporary players who are really good. I would listen to Bruce Molsky. I would listen to, there are lots of new people who've come up recently, but I don't know how widely this stuff is. I listened to Brad Leftwich, who's a wonderful fiddler. I listened to Rafe Stefanini. I also listened to some of the scope of old time music has broadened. I mean, the original focus in the New York City Ramblers' day was on the early commercially recorded country music before World War II. And then in the 60s, especially when Alan Jabor went down, to meet with Henry Reed, he went sent down south to collect ballads from a literary perspective. And he heard Henry Reed play fiddle and was fascinated both by his playing style and his repertoire. And he was the first person really Northerner who specialized in, or the first revivalist who specialized in the style of a particular player or a particular region. Usually before that, people were trying to be eclectic and play all this stuff. So he zeroed in on this guy, Henry Reed. And under his influence, other great players started focusing on the Round Peak area of North Carolina, players like Tommy Jarrell, Kyle Creed, Fred Cockrum, Charlie Lowe. And you got bands like the Fuzzy Mountain String Band, and you got the Alan Jabor had the Hollow Rock String Band, and you had the Red Clay Ramblers and some other, and then of course, the band that really put old time music on the map, which was the Highwood String Band. The Highwood String Band in particular was very exciting. Their tempos were, 190 clicks and, or thereabouts. And they were very funny and they were very good. And they developed a cult following. I mean, the real explosion of interest in old time music. I mean, a lot of people, I think people from some of those other early bands noticed that, that Plank Road or the Fuzzy Mountain String Band, those people said, well, everybody liked our music, but nobody went crazy over our music like they did over Highwoods. So I would try to dig up, there's an album of some of the greatest hits called Feed Your Babies Onions. which was the name of a tune, the subtitle of which is So You Can Find Them in the Dark. That would be a good introduction as well. Or the best introduction is to go to an old-time music festival at Clifftop in Clifftop, West Virginia, which is not too far from Beckley, not too far from Somerville, not too far from Fayetteville. That's an amazingly good festival. It's worth going there. I know a lot of bluegrass musicians show up there. Tim O'Brien is almost a regular there, for instance. I recommend that.
So, if someone wanted to hear some of your music, where would someone find your music?
You know, the best thing to do is do Steve Arkin videos on YouTube. There are a lot of videos of me from jam sessions and from concerts. I'm in a band now that's based in Ithaca, New York, called New Cut Road. There is a commercial album that was extremely popular, very, very top selling. It's sold out, but you can still download it. The band was Troublesome Creek, and the album was Fast as Time Can Take Me. It was on the County label. And there's still a County website, and you can get it on Amazon. You can get it on other websites as well. But it's called Fast as Time Can Take Me by Troublesome Creek String Band.
And thanks so much, Steve. We might have to do a part 2 because I know there's so much more where this all came from. But is there anything that we're leaving out that you'd like to add?
I mean, I don't know. You know, I've had a lot of interesting adventures. You don't have enough time to hear about them all.
I would gladly sit down with you and do this again.
You would? Okay.
Yeah, and I'm going to be back at your house again soon.
Sure.
Okay, well, let's call that the end of installment number 1. Thank you, Picky Fingers. Enjoy the banjo forever and spread the good word. See you soon.
And that's going to do it for Aaron Jonah Lewis's interview with former Bluegrass Boy Steve Arkin. Thanks for joining me today. Thank you especially to Clint Myers, who was the Patreon supporter of this episode. Go to patreon.com/banjopodcast to learn more about that. You heard a bunch of sound clips in this, and I want to let you know what those were. So in order, it was Yell in the Shoats. I have no idea what that means, but the title of the tune is Yell in the Shoats by the Troublesome Creek String Band, the Banana Boat Song by the Terriers, Darling Corey performed by the Weavers, Devil's Dream by Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, Jeff Sturgeon performed by Bruce Molsky, Soldier's Joy played by Henry Reed, and then Walkin' in the Parlor by the Highwoods String Band. You can keep in touch with me at pickyfingersbanjopodcast@gmail.com. And everyone stay warm out there, all right? It's hard to play banjo with cold fingers, so I'm going to do the same, and I'll start working on the next episode, and I'll see you next time.